So welcome to the audience, and thanks everybody for joining us. My name is Jamil Jaffer, and welcome to the National Security Institute's 2020-2021 initiative on China. We are thrilled today to have two excellent speakers and moderators with us today. Today is our featured event on competition cyberspace. The National Security Institute was founded 3 years ago to fill a gap in academia by standing up for a robust American national security posture and providing realistic, actionable recommendations to policymakers. To achieve that goal, today we're going to talk about China's rise and this issue of competition in the cybersecurity arena. We have with us today Jennifer Griffin, who serves currently as the national security correspondent for Fox News. Since 2007, Jennifer has traveled and reported daily from the Pentagon, where she questions senior military leaders, travels to war zones, and reports on all aspects of the military, including the current wars against ISIS and Al-Qaeda. She's covered major international news stories extensively, including the attack on the U.S. consulate in Benghazi, Libya, on September 11, 2012, and the killing of Osama bin Laden in 2011. Jennifer is a graduate of Harvard University and received a BA in comparative politics. She's also a co-author of This Burning Land, Lessons from the Front Lines of the Transformed Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, which she wrote with her husband, Greg Meyer, regarding their experience in Israel. And we're joined today also by Vice Admiral T.J. White, who's had 3 decades of experience as a national security practitioner, strategist, and cyber operations expert, leading joint military formations and combined intelligence community organizations. He's commanded all levels within the Navy and the Joint Service, and most recently left the Navy as Commander, United States Fleet Cyber Command, U.S. 10th Fleet, U.S. Navy Space Command, and previously served as Commander, U.S. Cyber Mission Force, U.S. Cyber Command. He's a former Director of Intelligence for U.S. Indo-Pacific and has served globally in various combat zones and conflict areas supporting competition dynamics. He's a 1987 graduate of the Naval Academy and holds additional diplomas from the Naval Postgraduate School, the Naval War College, and NDU. I'd like to thank Jennifer and Vice Admiral White for joining us. Jennifer, over to you. Take it away.
Thank you, Jamil. Thanks for that great introduction. And I'm so grateful to be joined today by Admiral T.J. White. When I think back of where cyber has come and how in your 33-year career in the Navy, you went from a cryptologist to a cyber expert, and you focused on the Indo-Pacific region, but your time up at Fort Meade as head of the 10th Fleet, that was really just established 11 years ago. So we're talking about a brand new part. When we look at our warfighting machine, cyber is a new battlefield, as we've said many times before. You had 14,000 sailors under you at Fort Meade. Tell me a little bit, TJ, how you got into cyber. How did you go from being a cryptologist to a cyber expert?
Jennifer, thanks. And to Jamil and the team, it's a pleasure to be here today. Yeah, so honestly, Jennifer, begins a little bit before that. My interest in things national security and service began with a very extraordinary high school guidance counselor who encouraged and challenged me to think about applying to any or one of the service academies to begin a career potentially of service. And she guided me through that process, and it worked out great. And I was blessed to receive an appointment to the Naval Academy, and I went. My whole plan originally was to fulfill my commitment, get a degree in engineering, and then transition out. But I had a chance to serve on Battleship Missouri, which was an amazing experience for such a historical ship. And there's a little bit of a story about, was that a modern warfighting platform in 1990-91 when she went to conflict in Desert Shield, Desert Storm, given that she was essentially designed and blueprinted in the mid-30s. So I showed up as a young ensign on a ship that was effectively 50 years old, but she had a position of prominence in that conflict. I was blessed to serve in a position on that ship that allowed me to get insight into the U.S. intelligence community, and I learned a lot. And I was impressed with what they did and how they supported our operations. So when I was in my master's degree program in Monterey, I pursued a lateral transfer redesignation to cryptology, which I got. I had a couple tours in the Navy and in the intelligence community, and began to specialize in cyberspace in the early 2000s with an assignment at U.S. 7th Fleet in Japan, embarked on the USS Blue Ridge. So I just kept enjoying it. The deal I made was if it ever stopped being fun, we would transition out, but it always was fun, and the people were amazing. So that was my journey into cyberspace via cryptology. And as I'm fond of saying, In the national security business, there is no cyberspace but for cryptology. And that is reflective in the mission generally executed at the National Security Agency and elsewhere, which is about making and breaking codes. And in the national security business, we have to trust our communications, we have to trust our command and control. They are peerless at it. And the energy and the insight, the innovation and the sheer intellectual throw weight that they bring to the fight is incredible. And it was a great privilege to be associated with them in some small measure throughout my career. So that's kind of it.
Well, it's a fascinating journey, and I know you're down in Houston right now, and you experienced that power outage that came from this severe winter weather, 4 days without electricity. You might have thought at that time that that was a cyber attack, or it could have. We've been hearing for years about what will happen if China or Russia get into the U.S. infrastructure. We now have evidence that they have gotten into that infrastructure. What did you think when you were going through that last week or the week before?
Well, other than sort of being worried about pretty pedestrian things like how to stay warm and how to get water, it didn't take long to think about the vulnerability that we have and the great dependency that we have as a nation on these things called critical infrastructure sectors, right? So 16 of them throughout the nation, a great partnership between the private sector. They effectively in the US own and operate, probably 95% of all that would be considered cyberspace in and around the US that impacts the US citizens and consumers. And it's fragile. And it's fragile for a lot of reasons. Some of the technology is very old and some of the technology is very, very new. And making all of that work together seamlessly with a high degree of interoperability and confidence is a challenge every day. There's just interestingly some recent reporting over the last couple of days about some global signaling maybe coming from China with respect to India. Border clashes that have been on and off over the last couple of decades have taken a new level of interest and activity over the last year or so. And a recent report talking about Chinese affiliated actors being inside the Indian power grid. It doesn't take long to think or to make a logical leap that would be possible here in the United States.
Let's go back and dig in a little bit about that particular case. We've heard so much about solar winds attributed to Russia, and it's made us think a lot about our own vulnerabilities, infrastructure, supply chain issues. But that incident that you're referring to in India took place in Mumbai on October 13th. Very scary. The lights went out, not an unusual situation in India. If anybody has ever lived there, you can have load shedding and power goes out, but the train stopped working, the hospitals went down, the stock market had to stop. And then when what we are now learning is that there was Chinese malware found in their systems. Talk me through, there had been the clashes, as you mentioned, up in the Himalayas, but this was, thousands of miles south of that. What was the message China was trying to send? Are we entering a new era? And so walk us through that particular case.
Sure. So my perspective on this might be different 4 or 5 months ago when I might have had access to more sensitive reporting. I might have a little bit more confidence in what I could say. I would also probably not be saying anything. So honestly, Jennifer, I would just offer that what follows now is conjecture, but I think it is reasonable. And I think that there's a lot of reporting in the open source that talks about vulnerability to power grid, commonly understood as ICS or SCADA systems or operational technology, and how those who are in the business of producing and generating and distributing power find great advantage in being able to reduce the manpower effort by being able to support remote operations. The value proposition of remote operations is, hypothetically in the United States, you don't have to get a guy up at 2 a.m. to get in a pickup truck or a crew truck and drive 150 miles to go isolate a possible fault in the power system. You can do it all remotely, and you can do it with convenience, and you can do it with great precision and effect. And so it is likely that if what is reported is factually accurate and complete, there's no reason to suspect that it's not, but I think we need to be careful with the terms. I'll return to that in a minute. I think China would say, as we interact on the world stage in conversations and dialogue between nations, two very large nations, you might, on the one hand, think India about how far you are prepared to press the case or the argument. And we may have outsized ability to have an impact on your domestic security and stability. And I think that's honestly one of the things that cyberspace represents that we haven't fully thought about. It moves fast, it moves at great scale, it runs deep, and it takes action across a wide front. So you mentioned border clashes in the Himalayas at 10, 12, 15, 18,000 feet, and an opportunity to impact the power grid 1,500 miles south. And so the ability to distinguish where the front line is and where the rear area is might get a little confusing. I would ask Jennifer, just to be very clear, that we try to be very precise, when we use terminology, systems being targeted by cyber actors, infrastructure being exploited, and then the word attack. You've been in the national security business for a long time reporting on it. I think you would say the uniformed military tries to be very, very deliberate and precise in the use of the term attack. I think that comes at the end of a probably pretty long chain, and it's very deliberate. And I don't know that, there's a lot of opinion about what is or isn't an attack in cyberspace. I think a second thing I would like to sort of point out, whether it's SolarWinds, which you mentioned, which is a public disclosure in December, mid-December of 2020, or the power outage in Mumbai, which happened in, I think, October of 20. It is likely that whoever the adversary was began to target and conduct operations in those infrastructures well in advance of those dates, right? So cyberspace occupies this unusual character where it moves very, very fast and it moves very, very slow. In order to get to the very fast unfolding effect, you probably have to commit an awful lot of time, energy, and effort, and invest in what we would call target systems analysis to gain access and to maneuver into those networks.
Should we assume that China and Russia have both infiltrated our infrastructure, our electrical grid?
Yeah, so I would say I had a previous boss of mine say, as a combatant commander, he was paid to look at the world through a dark lens, and to always consider the world as a glass half empty as opposed to half full. I think if you're in the national security business and your charge is to defend the nation, you kind of have to assume the worst case. So I am easily intellectually and emotionally committed to the idea that we are certainly exposed, very vulnerable, almost completely dependent. And as a consequence, if we think China and Russia are peer actors, we should view ourselves as penetrated.
And can we assume that we've also penetrated their electrical grids and infrastructure?
Yeah, so I would be loath to talk too openly about U.S. capabilities, so I won't. But I will say it is the business of the U.S. Department of Defense and its military to be prepared and to consider the full range and the full continuum of operational capability in all domains. That's what we get paid to do.
I think what's interesting about the China story in Mumbai is that for years, for the last decade or so, we've thought of China as sort of siphoning up intellectual property. Their cyber attacks were slightly different than the Russians in that way. And now it seems like we've entered into a 2.0 situation where they're flexing their muscles a little bit, and they're showing that actually, we do have an ability to use this as a weapon. What are you seeing, and is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think the first obligation we have in this space is to look at any competitor or adversary fulsomely, completely, and with no blinders on. And I think we should look at China as very, very capable, certainly competent. They have their own national security strategy and interests as they define them. The challenge we have is that they historically have been more opaque to us than not. Although interestingly, they do publish a lot. They do publish a lot in military journals and in the public domain and the open source. And a lot of their rhetoric that is 15, 20, 25 years old has unfolded over time. But China is, they are an interesting, I fear calling them anomaly, but we should have been more thoughtful and apply a little bit more foresight with respect to China, in my opinion. We know they went to school on us in 1990-91. You know, the U.S. military's performance in the Gulf War, sometimes referred to as the first information war, was stunning. You know, commonly referred to from precision targeting to cruise missiles at 1,000 kilometers to the pace of maneuver that the Marines and ground forces conducted. The full instantiation of a fully integrated air operations center to manage both ISR and precision strike, amazing. China went to school on that. Their ability to not respond to U.S. carrier strike group presence in and around Taiwan and the Taiwan Straits in the mid-90s probably shook them to their core. And they embarked, you've been at the Pentagon for a while, so you know we do this funny thing called 5-year planning cycles called POMs. They embarked on probably 5 or 6 years back-to-back of continuous POM, 100% investment. If you take a look at the scale which they've generated their military forces, designed out of whole cloth and built from the ground up to be competitive in great power competition, not just in coastal waters, but in expeditionary operations and in blue water, what we would call a blue water Navy. In addition to that, 5, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, they started the One Belt, One Road initiative, which is a purposeful melding of their economic interests and a vast checkbook to their military interests. And now you have President Xi commenting and publishing about the rise in the ascendancy of the East and the decline of the West. And these are all things that have happened. They were forecast. They talked about wanting to do it. And we just appeared to be a little too casual in observing them deliver on what they promised.
So have we entered a new phase with China? And again, back to cyber, have they moved into a new phase where they're more you don't like the word attack, but more an offensive role?
Yeah, so I think, I just think we need to be judicious about the word attack, right? But other than that, you know, if you read US, you know, Joint Pub 3.0, and it talks about, which I would encourage everyone to get, you can go to it, download it from the Joint Staff. It talks about offensive cyber operations, which includes those things that look like exploit and attack. In order to get to an attack or to conduct, you know, forward maneuver in cyberspace, you have to have the ability to exploit in order to gain knowledge and insight about the target. I suspect that what China has done is just recognize the great value and the ability to operate with speed and scale. They can do it to a degree, at least in the beginning, with a sense of anonymity. And so when you grow up in the West and you think about these Western principled, you know, liberal democracies and the way that they value the sense of attribution, you know, we are reluctant to cross that line until we have 100% certainty, and that is increasingly difficult to get in cyberspace. I think China is taking great advantage of the opportunity that operations in cyberspace represent.
I was a bit surprised to hear that China had a hacker army of between 50 and 100,000 troops, if you will. How does that compare to the US? Where do we stand?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, what's commonly understood and available inside the cyber mission force, which is organized out of the services and presented to U.S. Cyber Command as the command commander, you know, that's a little over 6,000 dedicated forces to focus on that effort. And so you might say that it looks like 6,000 on the U.S. side and 50 or 60,000, you know, a 10x on the Chinese side. That's probably a good planning assumption. I think you could also ask yourself, how many ships have the Chinese built in the last decade? How many ships has the U.S. Navy built in the last decade? How many planes have they built in the last decade? How many planes has the U.S. military built? You know, how many missiles do they fire on an annual training exercise, and how many do we fire? Right? They're going at scale. Now, it is a little unusual, right? So, China has an 80 or an 800 nautical mile problem, depending on how you look at what their operations are across the Straits of Taiwan or in the South China Sea. They have the ability to safely transit to their overseas bases in Djibouti and elsewhere, largely because of the presence of the United States military overseas, providing access, not just to the US, but secure access to everyone that wants to operate on the high seas. And so we haven't quite figured out what those paradigms could or should be in cyberspace.
Let's talk about Taiwan. I was listening to the Senate Armed Services hearing yesterday, and H.R. McMaster was being questioned, and he suggested that he's very concerned that between the Olympics and the Party Congress, that Taiwan could be in a very dangerous situation in terms of Chinese actions. Do you agree with that? How worried should we be that China is going to take advantage of US distraction, the internal politics here in the US, keeping us from focusing as much on Taiwan?
Yeah, well, H.R. McMaster has had an interesting perch to observe things at the National Security Council at scale, right? So I would be loath to counteract that. I might say, though, that we ought to be, we shouldn't kid ourselves about what the motivations of China are, right? I think increasingly the one country, two systems, that is beginning to pale in terms of their acceptance of that. They are under a current international treaty obligation with the UK regarding the status of Hong Kong. They don't seem to care about that at all. They are doing something out in the West with the Uyghur population. There doesn't seem to be consensus about that, but certainly something is happening at scale to, part of their domestic population and citizenry that has a population count with 2 commas in it. So that looks like a minimum of 1 million or more than that. And that's just a large number. They are harnessing things like cyberspace, data science, machine learning, artificial intelligence to achieve effects with facial recognition, social credit scores in their domestic population. They are applying that technology and how they are able to clamp down on dissent domestically to operations in Hong Kong. You think about what they're doing domestically, you think about what they're doing in Hong Kong, under a international treaty, which they, some might use the word a little alarmist, abrogated that treaty in some fashion. Taiwan is a pretty simple military problem. It's a very small distance, and China has mass. And I do think that the West is generally, we have a history of being easily distracted. So we got to pay attention to Taiwan. Even if it's not about Taiwan, this is speaking very pragmatically, and this is a little impolitic, so I apologize and don't intend to give offense. But all the chip fabs are there. So if you're talking about modern America, industry and society and convenience and commercial activity and market dynamics and investment, and ultimately our quality of life, the linkage between chip fabs in Taiwan and the US market and US sovereignty, that's pretty clear.
Explain that a little bit more, and also how hacking comes in, because it's my understanding that China's already pillaged the semiconductors, the chips, all the technology that Taiwan had at its disposal. That's all been siphoned off.
Yeah, so that's a good question, right? So I just think, there's a lot of things that attach to the cyberspace. And so sometimes it's difficult to explain to people about what it all means and how it all connects. And so I've sort of adopted this idea that cyberspace has 2 general components. One I've called the ecosystem, which is the technology that makes cyberspace. The other is an environment, and that is people and organizations of people making decisions and doing things as a result or in cyberspace. To build a chip fab, you need a lot of capital. You need the ability to design in a very dynamic way to take advantage of introductions in technology. The other thing you need is a large degree in access to strategic materials, which China has a large portion of it. And their ability to impact or influence or clamp down on that supply is pretty extensive. So I think when one takes a historical look at those things that drive some national security concerns. For the United States, we didn't know what we were getting into in the 1850s with oil in Western Pennsylvania. When Spindletop in East Texas happened in 1903, something began to emerge. And you might say that oil had little to do with events in August of 1914, but it may have had a lot to do with events in the interwar years. And the US economy, its association and attachment to the petrodollar. I've heard data is the new oil, and there is no data but for chip fabs. And so when you talk about a great dependency, right now it looks like that dependency is Taiwan.
So would it be too strong an analogy, or is this the analogy you're trying to make, that, in the 90s, we were willing to go to war over oil in the Middle East? We really should be rethinking, recalibrating Americans' thinking that we could have to go to war over chips in Taiwan. And I'm not sure most Americans understand why Taiwan is so important to the US.
Yeah, so I would be loath, to go on record saying that we need to be prepared to go to war over anything other than what I would consider is the individual agency of US citizens and the sovereignty of our nation. That being said, though, historically, I've been paid to think pragmatically about consequences and dependencies. And nations have gone to war over a lot less. And the status of chip manufacturing and design. And it's not just, you alluded to this little bit about China stealing. They have perhaps gotten access to a lot of the design features and attributes, the blueprints, as it were, the extraordinary physics and electrical engineering that goes into chip manufacturing and design. But their ability to produce those chips, they don't have it. They're on that path. They're investing as a nation to build that organic capability. The US has offshored that capability. We can do the design, absolutely, but we don't have the ability to sustain our own domestic economy, within our shores. And, a lot of people smarter than I can talk better about onshoring, offshoring, the balance, but it also points to the value in having friends and allies, right? And I can tell you, my time in the Pacific certainly reinforced what I had, heard an awful lot of, which is, the value proposition for the United States is to be viewed as a trusted partner on the global stage and to operate with allies and partners. We ought to be fundamentally prepared to go it alone if compelled and have to, but we will always do better with friends and allies.
Let's go back to that issue of supply chains and offshore production. We certainly saw at the start of the pandemic and the creation of the vaccines, the dependencies on China for everything from, the fluid that goes into the little containers that are needed for the vaccine production. All of it was made in China. And I was having conversations at the Pentagon yesterday about how we were caught so flat-footed with that supply chain for biotech being outside the country. And Jamil has written a lot about supply chain issues. Solar Winds has brought up the issue of supply chains and how, if you get in through the back door, things can be implanted. If you're not in control of your supply chain, things can be implanted, and then you have what you have with Solar Winds. So talk to me about that. What do you see as the greatest problem? What are the solutions? What do we need to be doing as a country?
Yeah. Wow. That's, you're opening me up to a long soliloquy, so I apologize if I run long.
I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to let you do that.
Okay. So fair enough. Look, step one is to look at the data and to recognize the situation, right? And it is clearly obvious that there are supply chain dependencies. If you think about the pandemic, whether it was getting masks from China or getting an initial round of vaccines from China or any other, or some would say getting the virus from China, right? That was a very efficient supply chain, not problem, as it turned out. But I would also say, the quality of the supply chain, sometimes those masks weren't the best quality. Maybe their vaccine continues to pan out, and we'll see. They are trying really hard to make their supply chain better. The issue that we have, I think, is, we don't warehouse that much anymore. Everything is just in time in our supply chain, whether it's software or hardware, whether it's a gallon of milk at the store or a pack of diapers at Walmart. There's no large scale cache or I would say arsenal of built up reserve stock. And so we benefit deeply as consumers by that efficiency. That's how you continue to get more better quality at efficient pricing. I also think that whether it's industrial goods or internet or knowledge goods, the ability to safeguard and protect your intellectual property is very, very important. And that's going to look like, how do you do cybersecurity and how do you do cyber defense? I've heard the term, we need to adopt a whole of nation plus approach. So that whole of nation is bigger than whole of government. The whole of government looks like a partnership between the executive branch, the legislative branch, state and local. We need to do a better job of how we interact together, how in the US we exercise those authorities. That might be something that looks like the Coast Guard, the Title 32 authorities, the Guard Reserve Bureau, their attachment that they have to governors, and ability to do that sort of cyber reserve corps might be something that could be very, very beneficial. How you take state, local, federal, and how do you partner with academia and the commercial space and the private sector? I think that's going to be very, very important. And then that whole of nation plus allies and partners. A previous boss of mine has talked pretty publicly about collective security and collective defense. And I think that that's spot on. It has to be more than just exchanging data. We have to share information and knowledge. And I think that is sort of step number one. And, much like, honestly, much like I grew up as a kid watching Saturday Night Cartoon, that's how I learned how a bill became a law. I watched that cartoon over and over and over. And I just think that we need to adopt some sort of public outreach where we educate and inform citizens.
Well, if you're looking back, what do you think were the watershed moments in terms of the US-China relationship going back to 2010 in terms of cyberspace and incidents? How has it built?
Yeah.
What were the key moments?
Well, I think in the context of China, you could probably go back farther than that and just understand that they decided to learn from US operations in the information domain, as I previously talked about. I think China in the mid to late 90s pretty rapidly saw that their future on the world stage was going to be tied to effectively a Chinese Communist Party managed and directed national economy that they would very deliberately and carefully allow to adopt some degree of free market dynamic. That frankly powered their acceptance into the WTO, and they have been playing for a long time on this stage of continuing to be viewed, asking to be viewed as a developing economy. Within the space of about 3 decades, they have gone from being somewhere way down the list to now being the number 1 or the number 2 economy on the global stage, depending on how you slice it. That is an extraordinary trajectory. And so if you begin with competition then, honestly, our motivation for, my recollection, having been sort of in the early stages of standing up US Cyber Command, it didn't begin, and it wasn't about China in 2007, 2008, 2009. It was really about vulnerabilities that were presented to US military command and control systems, which has been written about, and frankly attributed to the Russians at the time. So I think we were thinking about Russia as a commonly understood peer actor, certainly in the espionage stage, and from a global dynamic as a deterrence partner and competitor. I think China has emerged probably beginning with President Xi. That would be very easy to say that. Operations that they undertook in the South China Sea with building islands, the establishment of the One Belt, One Road, the things that they've done with the market economy. So I think it would be difficult to say competition with China is only about cyberspace and just started recently. We often talk in terms of DIME, diplomacy, information, military, and economic instruments of national power. one might argue that China has a better dime plan than we do.
Are you seeing the Belt and Road Initiative seems to have hit some hiccups, some road, some bumps in the road, if you will. What are you seeing? Has it come to an end, or are they going to push on with that? Or are countries onto them and pushing back? Where do we stand?
Yep, so my sense is that some countries are onto them, but it's very difficult to overlook the combination of promise delivery on infrastructure, which on the surface looks like an improvement to your citizens' quality of life and ease of life, and the almost unconscionably favorable financing dynamic. They're writing a lot of fat checks, and I think if you are a small nation or an emerging nation or a developing nation, what used to look like kind of Washington consensus, IMF funding to sort of power, your advance, that's getting very hard.
What shift in policy that the Trump administration carried out do you think was one of the best things they did? And what advice would you give to the Biden administration in terms of how to approach the next, decade in the competition?
Oh, Jennifer, thanks for that opportunity to preclude me ever getting a job in government ever again.
Got to get you on record. That's my job.
Yeah. So look, I would say that every administration going back to the second Bush administration has made progress in understanding and recognizing cyber and cyberspace as something that need to be better understood and reckoned with. I think the initiative that was the national, cybersecurity strategic initiative under the Bush administration, that then became impetus under the Obama administration to actually establish U.S. Cyber Command as an example. So I'm very comfortable talking about that dynamic and why that was very important inside the Department of Defense, the recognition of cyberspace as an operational domain. When the Department of Defense does something big, like stand up a command on the path to be its own unified command, that means someone in the U.S. government is taking it seriously. And that began a dialogue with industry and academia about, just really what cyberspace could and should be. Other things that DoD did, they stood up to Jake. The administration empowered DHS with CISA and organizations like that. I think that's all well and right. I will say one of the things that the previous administration did as a military practitioner in cyberspace, they established the expectation that we would be prepared and be proficient to conduct operations in cyberspace. And that goes a long way. And I think recent activity by this administration with thinking about competition with China, thinking about supply chain dynamics, doing a review of critical infrastructure vulnerabilities, I think that they will arrive at the conclusion that they exist and that more action probably needs to be undertaken.
But if you look at SolarWinds, that did not deter Russia. Is naming and shaming enough? Or how should the U.S. respond to SolarWinds?
Yeah. Well, I would be loath to get in front of the administration, right? So I think as I've looked at what the NSI has done, Ms. Newberg and others, very accomplished, very thoughtful practitioners, a lot of deep experience, and great relationships, quite frankly, that bridge both sides of the aisle. Cybersecurity is not a partisan issue. Honestly, it's one of those areas which is widely supported, maybe not completely or fully understood in the political chambers, but it is widely supported as a consequential issue, potentially of grave importance. Look, naming and shaming should be part of the solution. It is rarely the only thing that you can do. This goes back to a little bit about the whole of government piece of the whole of nation response. Russian activity, alleged Russian activity, attributed Russian activity in cyberspace. Why are we surprised? I asked rhetorically. Operations that they conducted in Crimea conveniently after the close of the 2014 Sochi Olympics, ongoing operations in the Ukraine, shooting down airlines, little gray men, hybrid warfare operations, a pretty reasoned and thoughtful, comprehensive national military strategy taking on board things like Maskirovka, deception, information, competition, and confrontation. Honestly, China probably occupies an interesting perch right now because they can learn from some of the best thinkers in this domain over the last century, coming out of, well, frankly, Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union, and now with the current leadership in Russia, and then the US. From applied technology standpoint, and in my opinion, sheer innovation and thinking about this space, they have an opportunity to move very rapidly up that learning curve.
There's some good questions coming in, so I want to turn to those. So if you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A, and I'll try and get to them. But one question coming in from Brian Powers is, where is China's line with regards to the US, and how far would they go in breaching US infrastructure? How should we think of Russia and China differently in that sense with regards to breaching infrastructure?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? So I don't have any better or keener insight into this. I just have an opinion of a concerned citizen, right? We have a pretty well understood competition and escalation dynamic with Russia, right? We spent several decades understanding the consequences of actions, and I think that our mechanisms of signaling and making sure that that signal is understood as we intend it to be heard is better understood in a higher confidence proposition than with China. I think China continues to be opaque to us, and I think that there is probably the concern I would have is that they might misunderstand a signal that we are trying to convey. And so I think that is kind of fundamentally the bottom line. In both cases, Russia and China, they are thoughtful. They are, we can talk about this term responsible actors, but they are responsible actors on the world stage. They do have a strategy. They understand the instruments of national power. They do exercise an overview and purview of their national interest. What we need to do is just do a better job of trying to understand that.
And we have another great question here from William Deal. He says, perhaps China has 10 times the personnel advantage in military cyber warriors, but to what extent does our greater reliance on industry and contractors make up for this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I know William Deal pretty well, so that's a softball. Hey, I would say we have great opportunity with industry and academia, right? One of the features I would say about our system as opposed to bugs is that so much of our talent that goes into industry and the commercial space and academia has its origin in frankly, the military services, right? Many get out, many go on to do bigger and better things, to continue to innovate and to solve hard, challenging, and thorny problems. And I think one of the great credits to the DoD and other service institutions is to continue to foster that idea of service to a nation, right? And a sense of contributing to something bigger than self, whether it's community or nation.
And just to follow up on that, does the US need to start earlier in school and start the way we did with STEM, focus on these cyber warriors and starting in grade school, understanding cyber better? And what are we doing to build up this national treasure, which is really our people? Yeah.
Hey, so that's a really good question. You've kind of uncovered a pet rock of mine, Jennifer, so thanks. Look, a couple thoughts about young kids today, right? Yep. So my parents told me that we were the end of civilization. I'm sure my grandparents told them that they were the end of civilization. So I'm generally pretty happy and optimistic about our future, right? I have a mentor of mine who talks about we need to make sure we understand, however, the difference between a digital native and an app native. Everybody that's under the age of 18 today is certainly an app native, very comfortable with this idea of multitasking, although an awful lot of data suggests that might be foolhardy. We do need to get after this digital native, though. We need to foster talent and innovation and expertise in those things that I would say look like the ecosystem of cyberspace, right? The technology that builds it and secures it. The other thing, though, is I've become fond of adopting a term called cyber anthropology over the last couple of years, which is really, there's an awful lot of value in understanding how people and cultures use cyberspace. And so whether it's sociology or the humanities or the liberal arts or economics or literature, take your pick, all of those are becoming the bailiwick in the realm and the output of interactions in cyberspace. And so I think that it's not just STEM. I know there's some people out there that might be cringing at me saying that, but one of the things I've learned is some of the most impressive young talent, the most aggressive, innovative thinkers, really, couldn't write a line of code or understand how it all works, but they had the ability to imagine how connecting an idea could have an outsized impact. And I think that we need all of it. And, we rose to the challenge with Sputnik in '57. We tried hard to rise to the challenge with a nation at risk, the education system in the '80s. I think if we set our mind to it, we can do it.
We have a great question from Sean Filipowski, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. What's China's interest in our agriculture industry and our use of precision agriculture? Are we vulnerable?
Well, so that's actually a great question. I would say two things. My sense, not being an expert, but just reading, news reporting, it looks like we are generating more and more breadbasket goods, the result of agricultural industry with more and more automation. More and more of that automation is tied to data production and analysis, things like GPS for managing how crops are harvested and managed, livestock and herds, the whole production chain. And so that's a risk. We talk about supply chain with chip fabs. We ought to talk about supply chain with consumer packaged goods that look like agriculture, things that show up on the supermarket shelf. Number one. Number two, we have a 330 million or so person problem. China has a 1.3 billion person problem. So China is undertaking an awful lot of interesting approaches to figuring out how to feed their population. And in the maritime domain, honestly, if you think about these warehouse factory fishing fleets that get underway and are underway, for 5+ years in the far reaches of the globe, rapaciously harvesting, the natural resources, commonly in other people's territorial waters or economic exclusion zones. That level of consumption is going to be a challenge. And so all of that technology, applied cyberspace, as it were, is going to be at risk for us and potentially to their benefit.
Here's another good one. I think have I done this one? Eric Wenger, is more effort needed to develop a common understanding of norms for acceptable government behaviors or global communications networks, or are the norms commonly understood and the focus should shift to communicating consequences for crossing red lines? Should we be talking more about red lines?
Yes, I'm not sure I understand the full expanse of the question, but generally, I think it is in the interest of every nation to be very judicious about talking about red lines. We have a recent history where sometimes things are stated as red lines or things are interpreted as red lines, and then we don't live up to them, or we don't honor, or we don't have the consequences that are stated in those red lines. As you think about deterrence theory, you have to be credible, you have to be capable, and you have to communicate. And when you get in the red line business, all three of those apply. And unless you're confident and that you have the national will to impose consequences on a red line being crossed, thoughtful business. I think what happens in cyberspace, in the conventional maneuver domains, things generally unfold, 15 knots if you're at sea, 60 miles an hour if you're on land. I apologize for all the land maneuver warfare guys. They might say it's faster than that. We're at 1,000 knots in the air. Cyberspace, it happens almost instantaneously, and it can happen everywhere. And so we should be very, very thoughtful about how we advertise and talk about red lines. I do think that we likely need them. Jennifer, I just don't know what they are.
Or do we need treaties like we had during the nuclear era? What form could that take in cyber?
Yeah, look, I think there's a role for treaties, and I think that the Cold War was a good example. How we got very close to that what was that called, the nuclear winter clock or the midnight clock, and how the instantiation of SALT and START and other things gave us confidence that we were walking back from the precipice of nuclear Armageddon. But some of those treaties, have expired, or nations that were signatories or participants have walked away. Whether they did that publicly because they said they walked away, or demonstrably because their actions have revealed that they're not adhering to those treaties anymore, is another case. Look, I think there's a role for diplomacy. I think that treaties, diplomacy, interactions fueled by a very effective intelligence community and a very strong, muscular diplomacy, I think there's value there.
It sometimes feels as though the U.S. has not responded to China for these many hacks. If I go back to the 2015 OPM hack, 21.5 million people, all their data is taken. The Equifax hack, 145 million Americans can assume that their data is breached and taken, and that China has it. Is it just that we put our hands up, or did we respond to these and we just don't know about it as citizens? Or do you feel that that was a real weakness, that we didn't respond to those hacks?
Yeah, so that's a very insightful question, and frankly, an uncomfortable one. I don't know that I could say that our response is necessarily public or not. We have taken some actions with respect to actors, attributed actors in China. There's been indictments handed down. There's been some public discussion. There were, presidential level discussions about conduct and operations in cyberspace. I think all of that is necessary and must happen. Look, I don't have a better answer for you, Jennifer, but people, I've heard talk about this. You need to be careful throwing, stones when you live in a glass house, and we live in the biggest, classiest house. And that's just a fundamental fact of life, right? So as a nation, what could we do? What could a response be? Sort of a non-traditional one, because everyone wants a response to look like a punch. I don't know if that's the answer. I think a response could be make it very, very hard, increasingly more challenging and difficult for them to punch us. So that's number one. We need to move away from the response or react business, and we need to get into a more assertive posture with our own defensibility, our own security, and we just need to be better.
Shannon Vavra of Cyberscoop has a question. Do you think Cyber Command should be targeting infrastructure and disrupting hackers that are responsible for attacks on hospitals, healthcare sector, Chinese hackers or otherwise during the pandemic?
I think Cybercom should be very, very concerned and cognizant of any and all actors, period.
I want to go back to Taiwan, and you were out in Indo-Pacific for so many years. What good do you think these freedom of navigation operations do at this point? Is this something that China just rolls its eyes at? Is it really annoying to them? Is it something that could trigger a response and escalate? What are your thoughts on these FONOPs?
Yeah, so I think FONOPs are things that the United States Navy has been doing since its inception as part of promoting the values and the recognition of international law and treaty, period. I think that we do it all the time, we do it everywhere, and we do it not necessarily targeted against any one country. It is likely that you could say that we've done FONOPs against some of our treaty allies and partners simply because in the international system we are registering a dispute to a claim of international seas, and that is the mechanism by which we table that. It can then go into the diplomacy process. It can go into the maritime courts and so on. There's a mechanism to do it. Sure. I think a FON op in and around the Strait of Taiwan, or interestingly now, potentially as interpreted by China in the South China Sea, there is risk there that it could escalate or be misunderstood. That would be shameful, right? And it would be a tragedy. I can tell you, in my opinion, based on my observation, the U.S. Navy plans those with great care, very deliberate, and they are always executed very, very professionally. And there is, in my judgment and in my view, not one scintilla of an opportunity to interpret those as any way aggressive, my opinion.
Talk about the role, this is from Robert Walker, the role of Chinese espionage efforts in the homeland. Should we truly be concerned about the 1,000 talents and the Confucius Institutes? Would you work with the Confucius Institutes?
China is a capable, competent peer actor on the world stage. It is a matter of historical record that global actors conduct espionage. We should be concerned about everyone conducting espionage inside the homeland of the United States. No, I don't think I would personally do business with the Confucius Institutes.
If you were a university, would you close the Confucius Institutes?
Look, I'll leave that as a value proposition for the universities, right? I just think that the universities should go into every engagement eyes wide open. Don't delude themselves. They should be affirmative in their action, as opposed to just not thinking about it.
We have just a couple minutes left. I wonder if you could close out by talking about lessons learned. And you had 33 years, you've seen the rise of China firsthand, both in cyberspace as well as in the at PACOM. What left you sleepless? What are you most concerned now that you've left government? What should we be focused on?
Yeah. Okay, so thanks for that. I know Jamil wants to get in here in the back end, so I'll try to keep it brief, right? One, I would just say the thing that gives me the most heart and the thing that I miss the most are the people that are in the mission, right? I was captivated by being a small part of that enterprise. I truly think that they are phenomenal individuals. They operate with great character and professionalism, and I think that empowering them and trusting them is to our advantage as a nation. And so that is what I miss the most. I also think that for our nation, those things that look like promoting the agency of the individual and the sovereignty of the United States are going to be increasingly bound up in cyberspace. The thing that concerns me of late is our ability to lose context in information and confidence in the trust of that information. And I think that is something that we as a nation could educate and focus on more and more. And then last, I would say there is something which I don't know how to explain or articulate that is intrinsically resilient and amazing about our nation, which is its ability to genuinely, I grew up hearing about the melting pot. I'm a big fan of the melting pot. I think that's an amazing feature. That is a feature of America, this idea of a constitution. Give us your weak, your hungry, your poor, and let Americans just be amazing, and they can. So thank you.
Well, thank you. That's a nice note to end on. And Jamil, I'll toss it over to you. And thank you for joining us today. It was a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, Jennifer, Admiral White, thank you so much for joining us today. What a great conversation. Really important points about collective defense, deterrence. Our adversaries are not 1,000 feet tall. We can and will succeed, but particularly if we remain united as a nation. So thank you again to both of you for being here. I want to highlight for the audience we have an upcoming event in 2 weeks from now on Wednesday, March 17th at 5 p.m. Eastern. We'll have our NatSec Nightcap series with Leon Panetta, the former Secretary of Defense. In addition, please check out our website at nsi.gmu.edu. We've also launched a new blog, The Skiff. The link is available in the chat box. Do check it out. After the webinar ends, there'll be a chance for a survey. Please take a look at it. And thank you again for being here. Jennifer, Admiral White, really appreciate it. We look forward to seeing you all again in the coming weeks as we focus on China's rise and preserving U.S. technology innovation leadership. Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a great afternoon.